Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Randall Younker, or Randy, as he usually goes by. We were joking. I was apologizing. He flew in late last night, and I said, we've got this inversion. The weather's terrible. And as we walked across campus, I said, typically there's these beautiful mountains and a big Y on the side of the mountain up here. And he said, oh, for Younker. Sorry to disappoint him, but for young, but it's close. Some of you may know, this is going to be short, some of you may know Matt Gray, who was a BYU student, graduated a few years ago. He's studying with Dr. Younker at Andrews University. As mentioned, Dr. Younker is a professor of Old Testament and Biblical Archaeology at Andrews. It's Seventh-day Adventist University in Michigan. He has done some excavation in Israel, but spent a large amount of his archaeological time in the Kingdom of Jordan. He's an expert on the Ammonites and I guess to some extent on the Moabites, right? And any other Israelites. If you don't know your Hebrew Bible or Old Testament well, some of the Israelite tribes settled east of the Jordan River in what's now the Kingdom of Jordan. Dr. Younker has published a number of articles, co-authored and co-edited a number of books, including the Madaba Plains Project series, which reports on archaeological survey and excavations in the Madaba Plains portion of what's Jordan, east of the Jordan River, up on the plateau. Presently, the director of excavations at Tel Jalul, a major archaeological site near the traditional site of Mount Nebo, not far east of the Jordan River and the northern end of the Dead Sea. I guess the best introduction I can give to you is that Dr. Younker is an enthusiastic, energetic, engaging teacher, and he's just a really nice person. So without further ado, we'll turn the time over to Dr. Younker.
Thank you for the kind words. What you didn't say about Matt Gray, as I was explaining to Dana, was that we discovered when he came to our campus from Brigham Young that we're seventh cousins. And that work is due to the good work the Mormons do in genealogical areas. I spent some time in Switzerland, found out that the Mormons had been there ahead of me and had already photocopied all the documents I needed, and we were able to establish this relationship. So he's doing a great job in our program right now. It's a pleasure to be here. It's actually warmer here, so it's nice to come from Michigan to the balmy weather here in Provo. We're happy to be here. I'm a little bit tired because the flight got on late, so excuse me if I occasionally pause. It's from a little bit of lack of sleep, the jet lag combined with the 4-hour delay with United Airlines, but we did make it, and we're glad to be here. When I first got into archaeology over 25 years ago now, I'm starting to feel old. The picture I noticed is from about the Middle Bronze Age. I need to update my webpage. But when I first got into it, I was living in California, one of my first archaeological excavation in Israel. I was working in the shadow of Mount Carmel, north of Caesarea on the coast of Israel, and I was quite excited for this opportunity. I just finished my graduate degree in biology. I had been going that route, and this converted me over to archaeology, this particular summer experience. And I had a great time on that dig. While I was over there, this will give you about a time frame for my beginning of my career. My kid brother, 4 years younger than me, saw a movie released here in the United States. And when I came back, he had no idea why I was going to Israel. Thought it was kind of a silly, crazy thing to do. I told him I was going over to dig things up. He had no idea what an archaeologist was or what they did. When I came back, he said, "Brother, I know what you do." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "Well, they released a movie while you're over there on your dig about archaeology." And I said, "Well, what was it?" He said, "Well, it was Raiders of the Lost Ark." And I hadn't seen the film yet, so he got me to see this film, and I had to tell him, I'm sorry, Greg, but archaeology isn't really quite like that. You don't have things blown up, big boulders don't chase you, and you don't fall out of airplanes and all this other stuff. He was quite crestfallen, disappointed that we didn't have that much fun. However, having now worked in the Middle East for over 25 years, I'm starting to think that that movie is more accurate than I thought. There's a lot of exciting things happening, some not so great, of course. We hear about the tragedies, but in my 25 years, we found an inscription on one occasion that resulted in a great Western-style shootout between the Bedouin and the police. The Bedouin wanted to steal the inscription. They didn't want to really hurt anybody, but they wanted that inscription. It was in a cave. And they came actually with a front loader, a bulldozer, to break into the cave to break the inscription out in the middle of the night that we had just discovered. We had put one lone Arab guard on it who was working for us, and of course he quickly surrendered to a half-dozen masked Bedou. But somebody called the police, and so the Jordanian Royal Desert Police showed up. There was a wonderful shootout. Bullets went over the place. No one was hit. They didn't really want to hit. I think they wanted to scare everybody. But they were able to arrest the bandits, confiscate the front loader, and then save our inscription. And then we got caught in the first Intifada in Jerusalem, and we had one of our archaeological vans blown up, which is another story. Maybe I'll tell that more tomorrow. So after a few years, I'm beginning to think maybe it's more exciting than we think. But we're hoping it's going to be more peaceful. And I shouldn't even tell those stories. I would hope some people come join a dig. Now, after hearing that, they won't want to come. But we've been blessed to be able to work in that part of the world for 25 years. One little quick anecdotal thing, and then I'll start showing some pictures on the topic. About a half hour, then we'll try and have some time for some questions. A lot of people wonder what it's like to work in the Middle East right now. I know that you folks have a beautiful center in Jerusalem. The Adventist Church actually has a little research center north of Damascus Gate, kind of in a crowded neighborhood where the Palestinians have their headquarters. And I have many times looked across at this beautiful facility you folks have. But I understand for the last 4 years you've also not been able to use that. And we've also not been able to go over to ours because of the current troubles of the terrorist bombings and so forth. And so it was with some apprehension we decided last May we had to get back into the field again. And we returned to Jordan, in this case, across the river. But right when we got there, unfortunately, the prison scandal broke out. You know, things were starting to look better, but then this prison scandal broke out. I remember one of the first things I heard when I arrived in Jordan by actually a Jordanian friend of mine. If I could find an American, I'd kill him. You know, and I kind of, and I could understand because spread all over the newspapers, of course, was this, embarrassment for the United States with the prisoners who had been abused there, as you've, heard about in Baghdad. So it was kind of a tense time. And I was wondering how will the Jordanians, who have a lot of close contacts with the neighboring Iraqis, how will they feel about us being there? And I only mention this because actually, in spite of these personal comments we heard occasionally, the people were very kind to us. They were very gracious. We didn't have a bit of problem. And this was most dramatically illustrated when a couple weeks into our stay there, and this political situation was all abuzz, of course, in the country of Jordan, we had occasion to go to the middle of the country to Karak, a major city in the center of Jordan, a Moabite stronghold in biblical times. And while I was driving through the little town of Karak, fairly good-sized town actually, a Jordanian who was driving behind me was more impatient than me to get to where they were going, and they tried to pass me at the same moment that a bus decided to pass them. And it caused a weird accident where the bus hit the car behind me and drove it into me. So we had this kind of a three-vehicle accident with a bus, the car, and me on the front end of it. Well, about 30, 40 Arabs, Jordanians all poured out, and I was very nervous about how they were going to react. I was the only American there, and my Arabic is only shway shway. I could speak a little bit, and they were speaking very excitedly and very passionately, and I had this sinking feeling that they were all trying to figure out who to blame for the accident. And since I was in front of the parade, I would be the logical person. In fact, after a few moments, somebody came up and said, "You're going to have to go to the Jordanian police, department and see." And I thought, oh boy, I'm probably going to be locked away and my family will never hear of me again. But they took me away. There was a Jordanian who saw my plight and he came up to me and said, "You don't speak too much Arabic, do you?" And I said, "Not really." And he said, "Well, I'm going to stay with you." He says, "Don't worry." So I was appreciative of that. So I went off with all these other Arab men to the police station, folks from the bus, the guy in the car behind me, and they were all excitedly talking to the police officer. And I was wondering what was going on. After about 20 minutes, the police lieutenant stood up. He got everybody's quiet. And then he looked at me and spoke in English. He said, "I want you to understand something. You're probably wondering what's going on," which I was. And he said, "I want you to understand you're a guest in our country." And he said, "There's no way you're at fault for this accident, so you can be relieved about that." He said, "We're just figuring out who we are going to blame." And after a moment, he made everybody in the room apologize to me, which I was kind of astounded by. And so each of those people in the bus and the other car, they were told to apologize to the guest in their country. And they did that very graciously. I realized they weren't mad at me. And they were very gracious. And after they all apologized, I just made the common expression that, well, I appreciate that. Thank God that nobody was hurt. Well, they knew enough English to realize what I was saying, and they all, in Arabic, said, "Praise be to Allah, that no one is hurt." And they appreciated that very much. And then the police officer looked at me one more time and said, "You're American, right?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you want to sue anybody?" And I assured him, no, that was not the case, that the fact that everyone was okay and that my car was insured, I had no need or desire or want to sue anybody. And they ended up treating me very graciously. So that was just sort of a little experience I had to let you know that the people on the ground really are very loving, they're very kind. The traditional hospitality is still in play. And while we hear bad things going on both in Palestine and in Iraq, the majority of the people still are experiencing, I think, quite a bit of peace, and I am optimistic. I'm not trying to make a political statement here so much, but I am optimistic that, and hopeful that over the next few weeks and months we're going to see things improving, particularly in Palestine and in Israel. I'm very optimistic that the center that you folks have there will be able to be up and running again, and I hope our Adventist Center will be as well. Well, anyway, with that little bit of introduction, what I'd like to do for about 30 minutes is get into a little bit of a topic on controversies in biblical archaeology, and let's see if there that goes. This is based on a talk I share with my students sometimes entitled, Can We Trust the Bible? If you are not into biblical archaeology, has a discipline, it's been around depending on where you like to start things. Some people like to start biblical archaeology with about Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. One of the first books written on the topic of biblical archaeology was printed in Europe by a German author about 1830, thereabouts, maybe a little earlier than that. It was actually entitled Biblical Archaeology in German. And these early works were an attempt just to describe what life was like in biblical times. They weren't trying to prove the Bible particularly, they were just trying to illustrate the Bible. In about the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, particularly in the 40s and 50s, a number of discoveries were made in which actual names of biblical people, like Nebuchadnezzar, Jehu, the Israelite king, and many other names, Nebuchadnezzar, Hezekiah, and so forth, were being found in the monuments, particularly in Assyria. And this excited the public, particularly in England and the United States, to a lesser extent in the continental Europe, Germany, and so forth. It helped people realize that the people the Bible talks about were real people. But still, the people who were, quotes, biblical archaeologists, they weren't digging much, and they were just kind of treasure hunting. They were finding things that sort of supported the Bible, and they thought that was neat. In about the 1880s, a new development started. There's actually a parallel trajectory in biblical archaeology with biblical studies. We call it historical criticism. And in the 1880s, a key mark was hit when Julian Wellhausen, a German scholar, published a major work for Old Testament scholarship in which he challenged Moses' authorship of the Pentateuch, particularly, Genesis and so forth. The first 5 books of the Bible, although he also questioned other parts of the Bible's historicity as well. And that started a major controversy in the United States and England in particular, but also on the continent, about whether the Bible was historically reliable or not. And I could go on for hours about this battle, how it went decade after decade. It's been a very heated battle. For Christians in particular, for Jews as well, it's been an important battle in that for many faiths, their understanding of the faith has been rooted in an assumption of historicity of the biblical story. For example, for me as a Seventh-day Adventist, we are Sabbatarians, and we hold quite a bit to the event at Mount Sinai and the giving of the Ten Commandments. If the Ten Commandments were not given by God the way the Bible seems to describe, that would impact our theological self-understanding significantly as Seventh-day Adventists. The other part of our particular belief, Adventists referring to the returned Messiah, would also be impacted because New Testament historical critical scholarship has cast doubts upon the veracity of many of the things said about Jesus Christ. And so the theological stakes are very high for believers, and so they have been engaged in this battle with historical criticism. They have used archaeology to try and combat this particular battle, and it's gone on for decades. A key moment in biblical archaeology was William Albright in the 1920s and 30s, who actually went after Wellhausen directly and tried to challenge a lot of the Germans' critical perspectives. And he tried to show that archaeology can show that the Bible is historically right. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s of this last century, the 1970s and 80s, my own major professor, Bill Deaver, actually started criticizing the Albrightian school, saying that really the Bible isn't historically reliable, and he became sort of the dark prince that he's been called of biblical archaeology. He was the gentleman I studied under, so it was kind of interesting for me as a believer to study under a professor who really didn't believe, although I should say Bill has backed off from those more extreme positions in recent years. And currently we're entering a phase that started really in the 1980s going to our current year 2005 where people There's a new school where people are really questioning whether any of the Bible is historically accurate. If you look at the history of biblical archaeology, or the critics of biblical archaeology, they would initially say, well, maybe the Bible's sort of true, but certainly Genesis is not true. Certainly the creation story is not true. And probably the rest of the book, the story of the patriarchs, Abraham, those things didn't really happen. That's kind of where things were when I was first getting into this discipline. And then after that, they started questioning the story of the Exodus. Certainly the Israelites sojourned in Egypt. That probably didn't happen. And the idea that Joshua led them on a conquest of Israel, that probably didn't happen either. So they rejected that part. Where we're at today is they are rejecting King Solomon and King David, and in fact they would suggest that none of the Old Testament has anything that's of historical value. It was all probably written well after the Persian period, after the time of Queen Esther in the Bible, maybe almost into the Hellenistic or the Greek period. We're talking about the 4th or 3rd centuries BC. And basically the entire Old Testament is written off as a pious fraud, to quote one old historical critical scholar. So that's kind of where scholarship is today. There's been a big backlash by field archaeologists, not just myself, even those who are not believers. They've had some serious questions about the validity of this hyper-cynical viewpoint. And so we've been engaged over the last 15 years in a debate that's sometimes termed as the battle between the maximalists. Those are people that see that the Old Testament has historical validity into it at some degree. There's a lot of disagreement about how much is historically reliable, but they all agree that some of the Old Testament must be historically reliable. Even my major professor, Bill Deaver, says there are some authentic historical remembrances in the Old Testament. The minimalists, though, challenge that. So that's kind of where we're at in the debate today. Moving through a few pictures to give you some ideas of recent discoveries that have become focal points in this controversy. And by the way, this is not something that's just constrained or restrained to the halls of academia. About 6-7 years ago, I know PBS put on a big series on the book of Genesis, and that prompted a number of major news organizations, including this article in U.S. News, to ask the question. It's not really a postmodern question, I guess. It's really a modernist question, but it just goes to show you people are still wondering about this question. Is the Bible really true? Okay, great. Archaeologists are digging this stuff. Scholars are talking about this, but can we really trust the Bible? So this is a question that the real world out there is asking. I bump into people all the time in my travels that want to know, can we really trust the Bible? Is it, does it have any meaning for our life? If those stories didn't really happen, what does that mean for us? Older generations of biblical archaeologists, such as Nelson Glick, you see him pictured in the upper right-hand corner. He was sort of a student of Albright. He wrote back, this was republished in '69, but it was reprinted from earlier statements. It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. A very optimistic, positive assessment. There are still a few scholars that would make that statement today, although their numbers are diminishing. How does archaeologists help us with this skepticism we see by the minimalists? I would suggest that archaeology, and this is sort of a personal faith statement on my part, and maybe in a few minutes you can ask me about that or give me your impressions about it. I would suggest that probably archaeology is not well suited to prove that God intervened in the affairs of mankind. I try and share with my students, I happen to believe in the Bible, so you know where I'm coming from. I'm a person of faith. I am not embarrassed to claim that I'm a Christian. I believe in the historical veracity of Scripture, the Old Testament and the New Testament. So now you know kind of where I'm coming from. I'm labeled a conservative. I guess I'd also be branded an evangelical. I believe in Jesus Christ as my personal Savior. Kind of a strange thing to say in academia these days, but that's where I'm at. My major professor knows that, Bill Deaver. So it's not like I'm hiding my candle under a bushel or something. I would suggest that many of the things the Bible says are not things that are verifiable in an empirical scientific sense. They really require faith, and a lot of my confidence in Scripture comes from my faith position and my personal experience with Jesus Christ as my Savior. It doesn't come from, hey, I figured out all the problems that I encounter as an archaeologist. Archaeology also has difficulty proving specific biblical events. When or by whom a city is destroyed, for example. When we come to Jericho, there's a lot of controversy about the city of Jericho. The Bible tells us that the Israelites conquered it under the leadership of Joshua through God's supernatural intervention. However, when archaeologists dig up that site, they do find a number of layers that were destroyed, but they don't find any that come with a label saying destroyed by Joshua in such and such a year. It just isn't there. Now, the cynics will say, aha, that proves that the Bible is not true. I think more reflective people will suggest, well, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Maybe we have the wrong site, maybe we have the wrong level, maybe it's been misstated. And I can speak as a field archaeologist that those are all possibilities. The confidence that even a lot of my colleagues will say when they make public pronouncements or publish things, when you really know the details behind how they got to the conclusion, you'll realize it's not always as solid or as certain as they make it seem in the public forum. I'm not sure I should speak out of school, but maybe I will. My major professor, who I like very much, admire, William Deaver, he doesn't share my faith perspective at all, but he's always been respectful. I understand he's been here on your campus to speak a few years ago as well. He doesn't share our faith perspective, but he is respectful of it. And I remember him one time telling me when he got in front of society, professional archaeologists, of scholars, his peers, that the more uncertain he was of a certain point he had to make in his presentation, the more confident and loudly he spoke, so that the people would not be suspicious of his doubts. And he told me he even puts on a power suit for some of these presentations. He put on a dark suit just like a businessman is trained to do. When you're trying to make a big sales pitch to, important people you're trying to impress, you speak loudly, confidently, like you know what you're doing. You wear that, dark suit so that you have a sense of authority. So he uses the same kinds of tricks to try and make scholarly points. And so while we can't always say who destroyed a city, we don't have that kind of evidence, the skepticism is not always warranted either. We frankly just need to say on an empirical basis, we really don't know. We can't prove or disprove the Bible. Archaeology, though, is helpful in a number of positive ways. While it can't prove the Bible in the way we'd often hope, it can help disprove bad theories about the Bible, and I see that happening all the time. Archaeology can disprove bad theories that are negative towards the Bible. Even Bill Deaver, when I was studying with him, said you've always got to look out for that ugly fact that destroys the elegant theory. Scholars spin wonderful theories about what they think happened, but all it takes is one lousy discovery in the ground, and your whole theory, you may have been spending 20 years on it, it comes tumbling down, and you've got to rewrite all your books. Your teachers don't like to rewrite all those books, and so they often are very reluctant to give up with those ideas. But that is a reality of academia as well, and it's very useful in helping with certain problems. One of the first classes I took in biblical archaeology was at California State University in a secular environment under another good friend of mine, Professor Howard Goldfried, who was, again, trained in the classical, historical, critical approach to the Bible. As he was teaching me, I was in my master's program at that time, he said, one of the reasons we know the Bible is not reliable is because of camels. This was my introduction to historical criticism and Wellhausen and all that. And I said, camels, what are you talking about? And he said, well, the Bible says that Abraham had camels, right? And well, yeah. To me, that was not a big deal. I was younger back then, and, the Middle East is full of camels. Every picture I see of Egypt and Jordan and Syria, there's camels always walking around, and I assume they've been there for thousands of years. And he said, well, that's the problem. We know from archaeology, as we excavate, we don't find evidence of camel domestication back at the time when Abraham was supposed to be alive. That means that part of the Bible is anachronistic. It was written after the fact. It's sort of like me describing George Washington going to his inauguration in an automobile. We know that automobiles did not exist then. He had to have ridden on a horse or taken a carriage, but not a car. So a car would be an anachronism, and camels, domesticated camels, are an anachronism in the Bible. And he told me that the Bible's full of these anachronisms. Well, I hadn't heard that before. I pondered it. I wondered if it was really true, and I wondered what the evidence for it was. So I sort of put it in the back of my brain and didn't think about it too much, just sort of pondered it. But the question, did Abraham have camels? According to Genesis 12:16, Genesis 24, Genesis 32:15, there's evidence that Abraham and the other patriarchs had camels. But scholars say no, they weren't domesticated until the 10th century, well after Abraham's time. But as I was going through literature, doing my doctoral research at the University of Arizona, I kept bumping into these ugly little facts. This was a figurine that was found at Hama in Syria, just north of Israel. It was found at level J. It's dated by its ceramics, the pottery. It was found in association with the figurine to the years 2200 to 2000 BC, which would be about the time of Abraham, according to some scholars, or just before. The figurine, it was very interesting. It was published, the article was published in French, and if you look there in the right, if you're up in the close, it just says the figurine of an animal. They didn't want to admit that that big hump on the middle of its back could suggest that it might be a camel, because as one of the spin-off articles I was reading seemed to suggest, again in French, I was checking my French, I thought my French must be off, because they said, we know this looks like a camel, but it has to be a horse because camels weren't domesticated back then. That's sort of an example of circular reasoning. And so that kind of got me wondering, well, how good is the evidence against camels? And I kept bumping into other little things. This was a petroglyph that was found in Egypt, dates to, according to the accompanying hieroglyphics, dates to 2423 to 2263 BC, and it shows a man on the right leading a camel by a rope, which would suggest the camel was probably domesticated. If not, that guy's pretty strong to be able to drag him around with the rope. And then just a few years ago on my own, I was doing some research in the Sinai area, north of the traditional St. Catherine's, Mount Sinai. This picture is not the best, but I was looking at some ancient inscriptions from the Egyptians, and they date to the Bronze Ages, before 1500 BC. And if you look closely right here, you can see a camel with a hump very clearly being led by a man and some other animals. I'm sorry, that picture isn't as clear. I'm in fact hoping to go back and reshoot this. But I've showed this to professional scholars, and they agree with me that this is a camel petroglyph, and it shows a domesticated camel back during the later patriarchal period. So I presented this in a paper in Jordan earlier this year, and I said, maybe we need to rethink this whole thing. There were a couple scholars who were very wedded to the idea that camels were not domesticated. They were very upset with me. But the majority of the audience said that the evidence is incontrovertible, that we've got to change our understandings on these kinds of things. So archaeology can be helpful, not in proving the Bible true. I think I have some water, excuse me. Archaeology can be helpful, not necessarily in proving the Bible true. This doesn't mean that God exists, that he created the world, or that Moses received the Ten Commandments from God on Mount Sinai. Those, to me, still require faith. But it does show that a lot of the incidental statements that we find in the Bible are not warranted. The skepticism about them is not warranted. We should have a little bit more faith and confidence in what the ancient writers are saying. And that would be a maximalist position. Give the benefit of the doubt to the ancient writer. Sometimes archaeology can support the occurrences of events described in the Bible. Not all the details. We don't have a story or any extra biblical proof from archaeology of how, say, David picked up a rock and hit Goliath in the head, then chopped his head off. That's kind of hard to prove archaeologically. But we can sometimes find evidence for the general events, such as the conquest of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. I know a very few field archaeologists would doubt that the Bible got that right. We've actually been to Samaria. We've been able to excavate there, and it was destroyed at the very time period the Bible suggests that it would, and that extra-biblical Assyrian sources say that it was as well. The conquest of Judah, the southern kingdom, by King Sennacherib in the time of King Hezekiah, around 701 BC, or in the early 600s. That seems to be verified dramatically by archaeology. The conquest of Judah later, 100 years later, under Nebuchadnezzar, by Babylon, also seems to be verifiable. So a lot of the general events, although not the specific details, are being established by archaeology. Here's a view of Samaria, an aerial photograph of Ahab and Omri's capital in the northern part of Israel. This is how it looks today. Try my little laser thing here. Here's the actual palace of Omri, established in 880 BC, and the ceramics that we find in the site correspond very closely to the biblical date for this site. What's even more interesting is that we are told that after Omri occupied these ruins you see in this picture, that Ahab lived in the same palace and that he built himself rooms, a palace of ivory actually, and as the archaeologists were digging through those ruins, they found lots of ivory plaques that had decorated Ahab's walls. So these little details of the Bible seem to suggest that whoever was writing those stories down knew what they were talking about. They even knew what Ahab's palace looked like, how it was decorated. There are a lot of incidental things. We don't know much about Jezebel, Ahab's wife, but they have found a seal that several scholars have suggested probably belonged to the actual queen mentioned in the Bible. We can't prove this for 100%, but there is some Paleo-Hebrew in this, some letters, as well as some motifs that are typical of Phoenicians. And we know that Jezebel was a Phoenician queen who Ahab married. So all the details seem to suggest that, and it dates paleographically to the right time of Jezebel. So while this doesn't prove that everything the Bible says about Ahab and Jezebel are true, it does indicate that the plausibility of the story is not, unreasonable. Here's the site of Lachish in the southern part of the kingdom. It's a Tell site right here. A number of archaeologists have dug this over the years, most recently by David Yushishkin of Israel. We have a lot of information about a battle that was fought at that particular site. It's mentioned in the Bible, of course, in 2 Kings down here. But we also have a clay prism of Sennacherib. He records at least 8 campaigns to this area, and he talks how he besieged Jerusalem and imposed tribute on King Hezekiah. We have pictures of the Assyrians showing the particular battle at Lachish. You see Assyrian soldiers running up special wooden walls up against the ramparts to try and attack the walls of the city. You can see the Judahites fighting back. Here's a line drawing of the same picture. You can see the Assyrian soldiers firing arrows up at the wall. You can see the Judahites on top firing back. They tended to merge time in Assyrian pictures, so you actually have the Assyrians fighting the battle and the Judahites surrendering at the same time. Here's some of the women walking out the doors as they are marched off into captivity. Here's a more modern depiction of that same battle. Here the Assyrians, they have a siege ramp up against the walls of Lachish. Here are the Judahites desperately trying to defend their city. Here you can see where the central palace structure was inside of Lachish. They found the foundations of that archaeologically. They found the crest of the Assyrian helmets at the base of those walls. Oops, I'm sorry. They have found the catapult balls. The last picture showed Assyrian soldiers throwing stones at the walls. They've actually found the balls, the stone balls at the base of Lachish, along with other debris that dates precisely to the time of the battle according to the Bible and the Assyrian records. Here's some Assyrian archers firing their arrows at the walls of Lachish. And of course, the archaeologists found lots of arrowheads that fell a little short of the wall, bounced down below, and they dug those up. They are the very style that the Assyrians made at that specific time period. So all these little archaeological details make the story of the Battle of Sennacherib against Hezekiah's kingdom credible. It's not just something that somebody made up 400 years, 500 years after the event. Not for field archaeologists. Here's some other depictions of the battle. You can see the Judahites up here, the Assyrians down below. The Assyrians' reputation for cruelty is established by pictures like this, where they would occasionally capture some of the Judahites and stick them on tall poles, sometimes peel their skin off while they were still alive, called flaying, to try and encourage the people inside to give up before this happened to them. And here, of course, is the king, Sennacherib himself, watching the whole battle. You can read about some of it up here in the cuneiform script to the left. His face was hacked out after his kingdom fell, but this was put in the main palace in Assyria, and he was sitting there being fanned, probably sipping lemonade while he's watching the battle. And then, of course, 100 years later, we have Nebuchadnezzar coming down and attacking the same basic region. We have lots of evidence about this in the Bible, but outside of the Bible, we find archaeological destruction layers that date precisely to this time period, around 605, 604 BC. Here's a body that was found in Ashkelon that the archaeologists have dated to this very time period. A lot of destroyed pottery from the Babylonian conquest. This is Larry Stager's excavation from Harvard University. Here's Larry Stager himself showing some of this pottery destroyed probably by Nebuchadnezzar's army. And then some other sites that he visited. Most of these sites that have been excavated find evidence corresponding to the biblical and Babylonian accounts. And of course, the Babylonians left their own records that have been deciphered by linguistic scholars that correlate very closely with the events and the people mentioned in the Bible. This particular one talks about the appointment of King Zedekiah, who we know from 2 Kings chapter 24. So again, the basic point is the people the Bible describes were real people. The events that they are associated with were real events. What you can't prove is God's intervention or God's punishment or some of the supernatural elements. And then you have to ask the question, how would you prove those kinds of things anyway? This is Zedekiah's enthronement. Here's Jehoiachin of Judah a little bit later on. His name is specifically mentioned in here. We know about him from Jeremiah chapter 52. This Babylonian text tells how he received a food allowance along with his sons from the table of the Babylonian king. Archaeology can verify, therefore, the existence of many people mentioned in the Bible. And I forget what the latest total is. As early as the 1850s, they'd already found 50 specific archaeological discoveries that mention people from the Bible, all the way from the Old Testament, all the way down to nowadays we even have inscriptions from Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas. His actual ossuary has been discovered, the bones of one of the high priests involved in the trial of Jesus Christ. Here's Der Allah. This was a famous discovery of nearly 30 years ago now. You may not have heard of it, though. There's a famous story when the Israelites first came to the Promised Land. They encountered the Moabites, and a Moabite king asked a prophet named Balaam to come and curse the Israelites to keep them from coming into the land. While they were excavating at that site in Jordan, Der Allah, they actually found a small temple dating about 700 years after the time of Balaam, but Balaam was still being revered that much later in the land of Jordan. And on the wall of the temple, they found a number of inscriptions that are actually the incantations, the prophecies of the prophet Balaam. And the name is identical to what we find in the Bible, Balaam the son of Beor. And again, most scholars that I am acquainted with agree that this must be the same person the Bible's talking about. That doesn't mean they believe that the Bible is true and everything it says about this guy, but they at least will acknowledge that he existed. And therefore, that raises the question, is it possible the Bible writers knew what they were talking about then? It becomes sort of a question of faith. Here's a reconstruction of that temple and how the inscription appeared on the walls of that temple in Derala. This is in the Jordan Valley, just across from Jericho. We find seals of a variety of kings. This is Jeroboam II of the northern kingdom of Israel, dating the 8th century. We only have the copy of it. The original was lost after World War I. We have the seal of King Ahaz of Judah. I'm going to just go through a bunch of examples. We have the king Baalis, the Ammonite king. We actually found one of his seals on our site in our Audible Plains project. We were the first ones to find this guy extra biblically. Subsequent to our discovery, some people tried to question whether it was the same guy, but they found 2 or 3 more seals with his name on them now. Here's Abdi, servant of Hoshea, who we know from the Bible. King Hoshea. There's been several seals ascribed to King Hezekiah. Recently, there's some question whether one of them might be forged or not, and that's a new issue that's arising. There's a lot of skepticism arising. People are starting to claim a lot of these inscriptions must be frauds. There's no doubt that some of them are probably frauds, but a lot of them are legitimate. But because there's been this tainting process going on, everything's getting thrown up in the air suddenly. And I think some of it's probably motivated not so much by objective scholarship, but by religious motivations or ideological motivations as well. There's a lot of funny things going on. This is a fascinating discovery because it appears to be the bulla of Baruch, the son of Neriah, Jeremiah's scribe, the very person who wrote the book of Jeremiah in the Bible. Jeremiah, according to his own book, did not write his statements down. He received them from God, but had a secretary write them down for him. That secretary's name was Baruch, and they've actually found his seals in Jerusalem with his fingerprint on the edge of the seal. So in this case, some, again, Israeli scholars, these are not Christians trying to prove the Bible, but they have suggested that we actually have the fingerprint of one of the persons that actually wrote part of the Bible down, which is a rather exciting, dramatic find. And if you look closely on this particular photograph, this came out of Bar magazine, Herschel Shanks magazine, you can see part of the fingerprint pattern on the side of this particular bulla. We have Esarhaddon, the king of Assyria, mentioned here on an inscription found in Assyria, of course, I should say in Iraq today. He required Manasseh, king of Judah, along with 22 other kings, to supply building materials for him. We have Manasseh, who worked with that king, mentioned specifically in Esarhaddon's records. And here you can actually read part of the translation. I called upon the kings of Hadi of Syria. He mentions a number of them on the other side of the Euphrates River, including King Manasseh of Judah. So he actually appears in this inscription. Here's another place where he appears. And at Tel Dan, that's one of my favorite guys. That's Avraham Beiran, an Israeli scholar. He's in his 90s now. I don't know how you live to be 90 smoking that cigar, but I guess in some cases it does help. I don't know. Maybe he'd be 120 if he didn't smoke. But I saw an interview with him once. He was in his upper 80s by this time, and this young reporter was interviewing about his wonderful archaeological career. And when he was done, the young reporter said, "Wow, that was fascinating." He said, "I sure hope I can interview you next year," thinking that the old man might not be around. And I remember Beiran looked at him and said, "Why, you look healthy enough to me. I'm sure you'll be here next year." I like that attitude, and he's still kicking in his 90s. He's been excavating Tel Dan in the northern part of the Kingdom of Israel, of modern state of Israel. Here's the site right here, right on the border of Lebanon. It's one of those archaeological sites you can occasionally get shelled from the Palestinians on the other side. You have to be careful. And they were working in the gate area of the biblical city of Dan. And I won't go through all the details, but this was the general area of the approach ramp. And in the wall over here, they actually found a large stone. I'll go through all the details, but this was the general area of the approach ramp. And in the wall over here, they actually found a large stone. I'm sure most of you have heard about this, called the Tel Dan Stela, written in Old Aramaic, probably dating to the 9th century. Aramaic similar to Hebrew. And it was erected by Hazael. A Syrian king was always fighting with the Israelites during this time period. We know about him from the Bible and extra biblically. But what was most interesting was a reference to the Beit David, the house of David. Now, this was interesting to me because at the time this particular inscription was discovered, I had just attended a conference in Chicago where the minimalists were making the charge that there never was a King David. That King David was no more historical than Arthur, the knight of the king of the Knights of England, in the Round Table and Lancelot and all that. They said it was a fairy tale. It was no more historical than Jack and the Beanstalk, one scholar said. And when this discovery was made, it was just after they had this conference. They were very upset because they had just told everyone there was no King David and no King Solomon. And here this guy had the nerve to find the House of David written on this inscription that this king claimed to have destroyed David's successors. Well, these minimalists were so enraged, they tried everything they could. They claimed that the inscription was a fraud. But to their embarrassment, the young lady that actually found the first piece of stone was a student of one of the minimalists. She happened to have signed on for the dig, and she assured him that no way was that planted there. She found it in situ, as it was left there thousands of years before, so there's no way it was planted. Well, then they tried to retranslate it. They said, well, Beit David can mean house of David, but David could also be dude. Maybe it's the house of the dude or something like that. In Hebrew, you can translate this word as uncle or kettle or a bunch of other ways. So they've been trying other linguistic tricks to try and make it mean anything but the house of David. But again, most of my colleagues in archaeology and most of my linguistic colleagues say, no, this is indeed the David the Bible's talking about. But it shows you the nature of the controversies that's going on. Shishak is mentioned in the Bible as conquering Jerusalem, and they have found lots of evidence of him down in Egypt, including his campaigns to Palestine that are shown on this wall in Karnak. Kenneth Kitchen, a very distinguished Egyptologist who also is a devout Christian, has been one of the leaders in attacking the minimalists and saying there is so much evidence to show that basically all the people mentioned in the Old Testament, all the events, and in the right sequence, particularly when you get to the books of Chronicles and Kings, it's all matching up so perfectly. He basically says you minimalists ought to give it up. Of course, they don't like that, and they've been having quite a battle in the journals going back and forth over this. Recently, Kitchen even argued that he found references to David in an expression, a place name that was located near Jerusalem that was called the Highlands of David. And he's convinced that this also is a reference to King David. At the city of Dibon in Jordan, they recently, well, this was a long time ago, but they recently restudied the famous Mesha inscription, which mentions several Israelite kings. The house of Omri, for example, is mentioned, Omri of Israel. But most of the inscription was broken. Well, all the inscription was broken up. Most of it has been recovered, but there's significant sections that were missing. But before it was broken, a fellow back in the 1860s had gotten a copy of it, a squeeze on kind of a wet paper towel. And this squeeze had not been studied for many, many years until André Lemaire, a French scholar, was looking at the impression of the section that was missing, and he's discovered, he believes, David's name mentioned a third time. So we now have 3 references possibly to King David. So this is the kind of stuff that's going on. Out of 20 foreign rulers, all but 2 or 3 have turned up in extra-biblical records, usually in their own home countries, showing that the Bible writer knew what they were talking about. Hebrew kings and external records begin with Omri and Ahab, who lived around 853 B.C., Since Mesopotamian kings had not penetrated Canaan before that time, now 9 out of 14 Hebrew kings are named extra-biblically in archaeology. Of the 5 missing men, 3 were ephemeral, didn't rule very long, and 2 reigned when Assyria was not working in the area. So we have at least 9 of these kings found extra-biblically in Assyria, showing that the Bible writers were indeed accurately aware of the interaction between Assyria and Israel and Judah. And there's some more information on this of Hebrew kings being found in local records. The sequence of the chronology matches up with the Bible perfectly, according to Kenneth Kitchen. And at least 10 different episodes exist both in the Hebrew and extra-biblical sources so far, and they generally harmonize quite well. There are some differences, but this can be attributed to perspective, agenda, propaganda, etc. So by and large, the ancients did not, according to Kenneth Kitchen, invent spurious history, but normally were content to interpret real history in accord with their views. The basic presentation of almost 350 years of the story has found in the Hebrew Bible of the Hebrew twin kingdoms of Israel and Judah comes out under factual examination as highly reliable, according to Dr. Kitchen. And then when we get into the New Testament, we need to stop. We've got about 3 minutes. I want to leave time for just a couple of questions at least. You have things like the Pontius Pilate inscription that was found. We have things like the Caiaphas ossuary I mentioned that mentions the high priest who was involved with Jesus' trial. That was a very dramatic discovery. You can see the inscription over there on the right. And then we have lots of things from the time of Acts, people that are mentioned. Paul's first convert on Cyprus, that family was very well known. Sergius Paulus. That won't get into the details. And of course, one of the most dramatic discoveries is the claim that of this ossuary that's supposed to contain James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus. And that debate's still going on right now. I saw it in person. Most of the scholars, I was with some of the best paleographers in the world, we saw it in person. Their initial reaction was it was authentic. But since it's hit the press, a lot of them are starting to back off of that because no one wants to risk their reputation on something that might be a fraud. So right now, this whole thing is absolutely up in the air. So anyway, this presentation was intended to give you a little bit of an idea. There is this battle. I think it's very important for those of us that believe in the Bible who are Christians. It's out there. We need to be aware of it. We need to not, though, completely lose faith or hope. It's not as clear-cut as you think. I think there's lots of evidence to show that the Bible, even on scientific grounds, is a plausible document that we can have confidence in and share with our friends. We have just a couple minutes. If anyone has some quick questions, maybe we'll take a couple before you have to head out for your next class. Way in the back. And you need to speak into a microphone, I'm told.
Kim Holland, I'm from the Department of Sociology. I just had a question if they found any evidence of Joseph in Egypt.
Some scholars have argued they think they have, but linguistically, no. We can't say, in my opinion, there are a few people on the periphery of scholarship that claim they have found name equivalents. That's another whole discussion. In my opinion, they have not found that evidence. There was a tomb that was found up in the northeast part of the Delta that appears to be a burial of an important Semitic person. There's no name involved with the burial. It's clear there was a statue found on the site of a person that was clearly from the land of Canaan, and a few scholars have suggested this could be Joseph, or if it wasn't Joseph, it was someone who lived or looked like Joseph. But to be scientific, we can't say that we have found any evidence for Joseph yet. We can only paint a possible, plausible background for him, but we can't prove him yet. Any other questions? I know we're just about out of time, but yes. Speak into the microphone, I guess.
Yeah, thanks. This is very interesting. When you look at the whole Bible versus independent books, wouldn't it be better to focus on the reliability of independent books, and wouldn't that be different than looking at the reliability of the Bible in its entirety? It seems that some books, depending on who authored it and some of the historical context, may be less reliable than the Bible in its entirety.
I suppose from a scholarly perspective, it's probably best and easiest to take it on a case-by-case basis. If I'm speaking as a scholar, as a scientist, I probably wouldn't want to make careless blanket statements. As a believer, I probably, in certain settings, would express a greater degree of confidence overall. But I know scientifically I can't establish all those points. What this kind of a presentation is intended to do is to show that the minimalist hyper-skepticism, I think, is unwarranted. When you really get into it, there are enough little facts that come out that show that at least individuals and parts of the events can be established extra-biblically. Now, for some, that's as far as they want to go, and that's all we can say. I think for others, a little bit of faith and some assumptions, maybe you can go a little further than that. Any other comments? Yes, the gentleman in the black coat right up here.
Who is the earliest individual named that we can find in the Bible and in some of these texts?
The earliest individual, if my jet lag isn't keeping me down here, probably David himself. That inscription with David. That's one of the Max Miller, who again is a colleague and friend of mine. One of his big problems is that prior to the time of David, we can't find any absolute verification for a biblical person. We do not have Moses. We do not have Joseph. We do not have Abraham. And of course, the minimalists have really made hay out of that, and they've been willing to just jettison that whole part of the Bible. But once you get down to the time of David, it starts clicking in pretty solid. And as Kenneth Kitchen said, from that time down for 350 years or more, it locks in pretty well. And even Bill Deaver is willing to allow that probably from that time on. I'm giving a talk tomorrow on Solomon's, our excavation at Solomon's, in Solomon's ruins at Gezer. He's pretty firm there was a King Solomon. So that's really about as early as we can go extra biblically. Yeah.